The fire took everything in a single night, and Mamie Rourke had not used the word home since. That was the truth she carried with her into the autumn of 1882, when she stepped off the westbound stage in the small cattle town of Harlan's Creek, Kansas, with nothing more than a carpet bag, a second-hand coat too thin for the coming winter, and a grief so old it had calcified into something she wore like a second skeleton, invisible to everyone but herself. She was 31 years old, brown-eyed, capable-handed, and done with crying. She had done all her crying in the field behind what was left of the Rourke homestead in Missouri, kneeling in ash and soot, while the neighbors stood at a respectful distance and did not know what to say, because there was nothing to say when a woman loses her husband and her 4-year-old son and her home all in the same night, and all because of a lantern knocked sideways by a prairie wind that slipped through a window latch that Thomas had meant to fix and never got around to fixing. She had survived because she had been in the root cellar, retrieving the last of the summer preserves, when the fire caught. She had pushed open the cellar door and watched the sky go orange, and the sound that came out of her then was not a scream but something beneath a scream, something that did not have a name in any language she knew. 3 years had passed since that night. She had spent them with her sister in St. Joseph, sewing for hire and helping with the boarding house laundry, and trying to remember what it felt like to want something. She had nearly forgotten. Then her sister's husband, a decent man with no malice in him, sat her down at the kitchen table and told her that his brother was coming to stay for the winter, and there was not quite enough room, and perhaps Mamie might consider. And she had stood up before he finished the sentence and told him she would be gone by the end of the week. She had not blamed him. That was the kind of woman she had become. She did not blame people for the reasonable things they did, and she did not expect the world to carry her grief alongside her. She carried it herself. She was very good at it by now. A woman named Clara Hodge, who ran the dress shop in Harlan's Creek, had placed an advertisement in the St. Joseph Gazette seeking a skilled seamstress. Mamie had answered it. Clara had written back with an offer that included a room above the shop, a modest wage, and a note at the bottom that said, "The town is small but the people are honest enough, and the sky here is a thing worth seeing." Mamie had read that last part 3 times. She had packed her carpet bag the next morning. So here she was, standing in the main street of Harlan's Creek on the 14th of October, 1882, squinting against the dust that the departing stage kicked up behind her, and taking inventory of a town that was neither impressive nor depressing but simply real. A row of timber-fronted businesses on either side of a wide dirt road, a livery stable at the far end, a church with a crooked weather vane, and the particular smell of horse and hay and wood smoke that she associated with every small western town she had ever passed through. Clara Hodge turned out to be a stout woman in her 50s with wire-rimmed spectacles and a manner so brisk and competent that Mamie liked her immediately. She showed Mamie the room above the shop, a low-ceilinged space with a brass bed and a window that looked over the side alley, and if you pressed your face to the glass and turned your head, a sliver of open prairie beyond the buildings, and she gave her a key and said, "Supper is at the Morrison Hotel on Tuesdays and Thursdays, and on the other nights you fend for yourself, but the mercantile keeps a decent stock of dried beans." "That suits me fine," Mamie said. "You're from Missouri," Clara said. It was not a question. "I am." Clara studied her for a moment with the frank, appraising look of a woman who had seen enough of life to recognize the shape of another woman's losses without needing the particulars. "Well," she said, "Kansas will either cure you or finish you. Most people it cures." Mamie unpacked her carpet bag that evening. She set her sewing kit on the window ledge and her late husband's pocket watch on the bedside table. She had carried it out of the ruins herself, finding it in the rubble of the bedroom, its casing charred but its mechanism still running, still marking the passage of time with a persistence she had found both comforting and unbearable in turns. She set it face down now, as she always did, because she could not look at its hands without calculating the exact moment the fire had reached the bedroom, and she was tired of doing that calculation. She slept better than she had in months. She met Robert Sheridan on her third day in Harlan's Creek. She had gone to the mercantile for beans and coffee, and a length of flannel for patching a winter coat, and she was standing at the counter waiting for old Pete Ambrose to find her flannel in the back room when the door opened behind her, and she heard boots on the plank floor and then a voice, low and unhurried, that said, "Pete, I need to settle my account before the end of the month or Helen Beaumont will put my name on her bad payers list, and I'll never hear the end of it." There was laughter from somewhere in the back room, and Pete Ambrose's muffled voice said something in reply, and Mamie turned to look at the man, because it seemed rude not to acknowledge someone standing 3 feet away. He was tall, lean-framed, perhaps 35, with dark hair that needed cutting and a jaw that carried a few days of dark stubble. He wore a battered work coat the color of dried oak leaves, and a hat that had clearly been caught in at least one rainstorm and never properly reshaped. His hands, she noticed, were the hands of a man who worked land broad, calloused, with a long-healed scar across the back of the right one. His eyes, when they met hers, were the particular gray of a November sky just before it decides what it wants to do. "Pardon me," he said with a nod. "I didn't mean to run my mouth before I noticed there was company." "You weren't running it," Mamie said. "You were just talking." He seemed to consider that distinction. "Robert Sheridan," he said, and offered his hand. She shook it. "Mamie Rourke, I've just come to work for Clara Hodge." Something crossed his face, recognition, or perhaps relief, though she could not imagine why a stranger's arrival at the dress shop would produce relief in a cattle rancher. "She's been needing help," he said. "Her eyes have been giving her trouble." "Good of you to come." "I needed the work," Mamie said honestly. He nodded as if that was the most sensible answer she could have given, which was a small thing, but small things had a way of mattering more than large ones in her experience. Pete Ambrose reappeared with a bolt of gray flannel that was close enough to what she'd asked for, and she turned back to the counter, and Robert Sheridan settled his account with the ease of a man who was known in this place, who had credit and a name and history here. And she felt the familiar hollow feeling of being new and nameless somewhere, which was a feeling she had lived with for 3 years and still had not gotten comfortable with. She paid for her things and left, and that was the first meeting. The second happened 4 days later, when she was walking back from delivering a finished hem to one of Clara's regular customers, and she passed the open lot next to the livery stable, where a man was attempting to control a gray horse that had decided it did not want to be controlled. The horse was not particularly large or particularly wild, but it was entirely committed to expressing its opinion, and the man holding its lead was Robert Sheridan, who was speaking to it in a tone of calm, reasonable address, as if the horse were a person who might be persuaded by a good argument. Mamie stopped despite herself because there was something almost funny about it, and she had not felt the pull of something almost funny in a long time. "She's not listening," Mamie said from the fence. Robert Sheridan looked over his shoulder without releasing the lead. "She's listening," he said. "She's just not agreeing yet." "Is there a difference?" "With Frostbite, yes." He turned back to the horse. "Come on now. I've got oats in the barn and nothing but patience for the rest of the afternoon." The horse Frostbite apparently flicked her ears and took a step forward, and Robert Sheridan rewarded this with a quiet word and a steady hand, and Mamie watched him lead the animal into the livery stable with the particular attentiveness of someone who has not watched anything with real interest in a very long time, and has just noticed that she is doing it. She continued on her way back to the shop, and did not think about him any more than was reasonable. The town of Harlan's Creek revealed itself to her in layers over the following weeks. Clara Hodge was, as she had suspected, a woman of strong opinions and genuine warmth, and she seemed to take it as her personal project to ensure that Mamie was not lonely, which meant introducing her to everyone who came into the shop with a cheerful insistence that brooked no refusal. There was Ida Mercer, who ran the boarding house and had opinions about everything and was usually right. There was Dr. Emmett Price, a dry-humored man in his 60s who had come west from Virginia 30 years ago and claimed he had never been warm since. There was young Deputy Tomas Vega, 22 years old and earnest to a degree that was almost painful, who tipped his hat to every woman he passed as if he had been told it was mandatory by federal law. And there was, present at the periphery of almost every gathering and conversation, Robert Sheridan. He was not the kind of man who sought the center of things. He came to town from his ranch, which lay some 4 miles north, she learned, a cattle operation of modest size that he had built himself over the course of 8 years, once or twice a week, settled his business, exchanged a few words with people he knew, and went back. He was not cold or unfriendly. He was simply a man who was comfortable in his own company, which was, she thought, both admirable and slightly lonely-looking from the outside. She learned his history in pieces, the way you learn everything in a small town, through offhand remarks and neighborly gossip, and the particular way people referred to someone that told you as much as the words themselves. Clara told her that Robert had come to Kansas from Tennessee 8 years ago with his older brother Daniel, and that Daniel had been killed in a cattle dispute, the polite words for a confrontation that had turned violent 4 years past, and that Robert had settled the dispute legally and thoroughly, and had not spoken of it much since. He had never married, Clara added, with a tone that suggested she had views on this matter but had decided not to air them at the moment. Mamie absorbed this information without comment, because she understood what it meant to carry a loss that you did not discuss. She had been in Harlan's Creek for 3 weeks when she first came to his ranch. It was not a planned visit. Clara had sent her to deliver a repaired coat to Mrs. Ida Mercer, whose boarding house was at the north end of town, and while Mamie was leaving, she realized she had walked further than she intended and was standing at the fork in the road where the town trail met the wagon road that led north toward the ranches. She had turned without quite deciding to, drawn by the open land, which had a quality to it in the late October afternoon that she could not name but that pulled at something in her chest. She had walked perhaps half a mile up the north road when she saw the ranch. It sat on a low rise in the middle of a wide, flat spread of land that the autumn grass had turned the color of old honey. The main house was modest, a 2-story timber structure with a broad porch that ran the full length of the front face, its railing made of rough-cut wood that someone had sanded smooth. There was a barn behind it painted red, which was faded now to a pleasant rust. There were 2 cottonwood trees flanking the house, their leaves turned yellow and falling in the afternoon wind in long, lazy spirals, and the whole scene had a quality that she could not immediately identify and then did. It looked like a place where someone had chosen to be. She had not meant to walk up the rise, but then Robert Sheridan came out of the barn with a bucket in each hand, saw her standing on the road, and called, "Miss Rourke, are you lost or are you just exploring?" "Exploring," she said, because it was true enough. He set down the buckets. "Do you want to come up? I was about to make coffee." She hesitated for exactly 1 moment and then said yes, because the sun was going down and the wind was picking up, and the honest answer was that she wanted to. The porch was where she noticed it first. She climbed the steps behind him and he pushed open the front door and held it, and she stepped up onto the porch boards, and the wind shifted and brought the smell of wood smoke from the chimney and the dry grass smell of the open land, and the particular quiet of a place that had no neighbors close enough to be heard, and something in her chest did a slow, painful thing that she recognized after a moment as longing. She did not say anything. She went inside. The interior was clean in the functional way of a bachelor's house. Nothing unnecessary, everything in its place. A stone fireplace with a good fire going, a long kitchen table scarred by years of use, bookshelves on either wall of the main room that were fuller than she had expected. He made coffee on the cast iron stove with the easy competence of a man who did it every day, and she sat at his kitchen table and looked at the books on his shelves, and the fire in the fireplace, and the window that looked north over the open land, and tried to identify what she was feeling. "How long have you been out here?" she asked. 8 years come February. Poured the coffee into 2 heavy ceramic mugs and brought them to the table and sat across from her. "You, 3 weeks," he smiled at that just slightly. "I remember 3 weeks. Everything is still strange at 3 weeks. What changes it?" He thought about it seriously, which she appreciated. "The first hard thing you get through," he said. "After the first hard thing, you know you can manage." She wrapped her hands around the mug. "What was yours?" "First winter," he said. "Lost a third of my cattle. Thought I'd have to fold and go home. But you didn't." "No," he looked at his coffee. "I didn't have a home to go back to by then. Daniel was gone. Tennessee was just a place I used to live." He said it matter-of-factly, not with self-pity. "So there was nothing to do but work through it." She understood that completely and did not say so, because saying so would have required explaining herself, and she was not ready for that yet. They drank their coffee in a silence that was not uncomfortable, and through the window she could see the last of the sunset doing extravagant things with the clouds over the western horizon, purple and orange, and a deep, burning red that she watched until it faded. And when she looked back at the room, she felt, for a moment, that this place had a steadiness to it that she had been missing for a long time without quite knowing what to call the missing. She thanked him for the coffee and walked back to town in the early dark, and that night she lay in her narrow bed above the dress shop and stared at the ceiling and told herself firmly that she was not going to make anything out of a cup of coffee and a pleasant view. She was not entirely persuasive. November arrived, and with it the first real cold. The sky over Harlan's Creek turned the color of pewter, and stayed that way for days at a stretch, and the wind off the open plains had a cutting edge that made everyone who encountered it outside wish they had put on another layer. Mamie had by now settled into the rhythms of Clara's shop, the morning work of cutting and fitting, the afternoons of detailed sewing, the particular satisfaction of finishing a thing and seeing it whole. And she had also settled into the town's social rhythms, which were defined largely by the weekly gathering at the church hall on Friday evenings, where the citizens of Harlan's Creek played music and shared food and maintained the social fabric of a community that understood, whether consciously or not, that this fabric was the difference between civilization and not. Robert Sheridan came to these gatherings occasionally. When he came, he stood at the edges, talked to the men he knew, drank the coffee that was on offer, and watched the room with those gray eyes that seemed to take in more than they let on. Mamie noticed him noticing things, and then caught herself noticing him noticing things, and decided that was probably more layers of attention than the situation required. She was talking to Ida Mercer about the proper way to patch a quilt, a subject on which they disagreed substantially and cheerfully, when Robert appeared at her elbow one Friday in mid-November with a plate of cornbread and said, "My contributions to these evenings are never as elaborate as Helen Beaumont's, but cornbread doesn't offend anyone." "Cornbread is reliable," Mamie said. "I have great respect for reliable things." He offered her a piece from the plate, and she took it, and Ida Mercer looked between the two of them with the expression of a woman mentally composing several sentences, but choosing, for once, to keep them to herself. "I've been meaning to ask," Robert said, "whether the room at Clara's is warm enough. She had trouble with the flu in that upstairs room last winter." "It's been fine," Mamie said. "I pushed the damper the other way and it drew better." He looked at her with a kind of surprised approval. "You know about flus." "I know about a lot of practical things," she said. "You learn them when you have a household." There was a small pause. In a small town, 3 weeks was long enough for the basic outlines of her situation to have been communicated, though not the details. "I'm sorry," he said simply, and she knew he meant it. "Thank you," she said, and then, because she was tired of the weight of people's condolences pressing on her, she changed the subject. "Tell me about your cattle operation. How many head do you run?" He accepted the redirect without making her ask for it, which was a small grace she appreciated enormously. About 140 now. Started with 60. I run a small crew, 3 hands year-round and 2 more in the summer. He told her about the challenges of the past season, the dry summer that had stressed the grass, the decisions he had made about which animals to sell and which to overwinter, and she listened and asked questions, and the conversation moved them through most of the evening without either of them noticing that was what was happening. She walked home alone that night, and the sky was perfectly clear and full of stars in a way that Kansas stars sometimes were, an extravagance of cold light, and she stood in the alley next to Clara's shop for a moment and looked up and breathed, and realized that she had laughed twice that evening. She had not been keeping count, but she had been counting, somewhere under the counting, and twice was more than she had managed in any given evening for longer than she wanted to admit. She went upstairs and sat on the edge of the brass bed and picked up Thomas's pocket watch from the nightstand and held it in both hands, looking at it. "I'm not replacing you," she said quietly to the watch, to the man who was no longer there to hear. I'm still here. I'm trying to still be here." She set it down and lay back and looked at the ceiling. The flue drew well, and the room was warm, and outside the Kansas stars burned on without concern for human sorrow, and she fell asleep. December brought snow, the first serious snow of the season, and with it a particular crisis that Mamie had not anticipated. Clara Hodge slipped on the icy steps of the dress shop and broke her wrist. The break was clean, the doctor said, and would heal well, but Clara was in significant pain and could not use her right hand, which was to say she could not sew, and the shop had 3 orders outstanding for Christmas, and there was a very real problem. "I can do all of it," Mamie said, the afternoon she helped Clara home from the doctor's office. "Tell me the specifications for each order and I'll manage." Clara looked at her over the rim of her spectacles. "All 3. Ida Mercer's wool dress alone is 2 weeks of work." "I know, but Christmas is 3 weeks away and I've got good lamp light and steady hands. Let me manage it." Clara was not accustomed to being helped. Mamie could see that, but she was in enough pain to accept it, and so Mamie found herself running the shop alone for the first time, which was either a burden or an opportunity depending on how she looked at it. She chose to look at it as an opportunity, which was a choice she had been practicing for 3 years. She worked long days and longer evenings, and she was deep in Ida Mercer's wool dress on a Wednesday afternoon the 2nd week of December, the snow coming down outside in soft, determined curtains, when the bell above the shop door sounded, and she looked up to find Robert Sheridan standing in the doorway, snow on his shoulders and hat, carrying a covered dish. "Clara sent word with young Tomas that you were working alone," he said, "and I had a surplus of beef stew that required disposition." Mamie set down her needle. She sent the stew," he said carefully. "I volunteered the delivery." There was something so almost boyish about his expression when he said it, slightly uncertain, as though he was not entirely sure this had been a reasonable thing to do, that she felt an answering warmth in her chest that she did not immediately try to name. "Bring it in, then," she said. "There's a stove through the back." They ate at the small work table in the back room, the stew hot and savory and genuinely excellent, and she said so, and he looked both pleased and embarrassed, and told her he had learned from necessity since he did not employ a cook. "You learned that out of necessity," she said, gesturing at the dish, "because it's better than anything I made for myself this week." "I had 8 years of practice," he said. "I've had my share of inedible experiments." "Me too," she said, and then immediately felt the faint sting of that sentence because her experiments had been in a kitchen that no longer existed, learning to cook for a man who was no longer living, and the memory arrived with its usual sharpness. He saw something shift in her face and said quietly, "You don't have to say anything about it." She looked at him. "About what?" "About whatever just came through your expression just now." He held her gaze steadily. "You don't have to explain it or account for it. I just wanted you to know you don't have to." It was such a precise thing to say. It hit her somewhere behind the breastbone with a kind of resonance that she hadn't felt in years, the feeling of being actually seen by another person, not seen through, not seen around, but seen. "Thank you," she said, and meant it in a larger way than the words suggested. He stayed for an hour, and they talked about nothing important: the relative merits of different types of firewood, the extraordinary stubbornness of Frostbite the horse, the way the snow in Kansas fell differently than snow in Tennessee or Missouri, because the flatness of the land had nowhere to stop it, and it accumulated in different patterns. She showed him the half-finished sleeve of Ida Mercer's wool dress, and he examined it with genuine interest and said it was impressive work, and she told him it was good basic technique and that Clara's work was substantially finer. When he left, pulling on his coat at the door, he paused and said, "I'll be in town Thursday. If you need anything delivered to or from Clara's house, I can take it." "That's very kind," she said. "It's practical," he said, which was the sort of deflection a man used when he wanted to be kind but did not want to make a production of it, and she filed that away among the things she was learning about him. She finished all 3 Christmas orders on time. Clara was proud and vocal about it, and gave her a small bonus that Mamie protested and ultimately accepted, and Christmas Day was spent at the church hall with most of the town, and there was music and food and more warmth than Mamie had felt at Christmas since before. Robert was there. He brought more cornbread, which by now had become a standing joke between them, and he sat near her at the long tables and they talked throughout the meal, and at some point she realized that people were noticing, in the pleasant, interested way that people in small towns notice things, and she was surprised to find that she did not mind. The new year 1883 arrived cold and clear. January in Kansas was its own particular test, a month of such sustained cold that the world seemed reduced to the essential: warmth, work, company. Mamie had all 3. Clara's wrist healed cleanly and she returned to the shop in the 3rd week of January, and Mamie was glad for her company, and glad too to return to her supporting role, though she had discovered in December that she was capable of more than a supporting role, which was its own small revelation. She was in the shop on a Tuesday afternoon in late January when the door opened and Robert came in, which was not unusual now. He came in perhaps once a week, sometimes on the pretext of an errand, sometimes without a pretext at all. Clara pretended not to notice the absence of pretexts, and Mamie pretended not to notice Clara pretending not to notice. But this afternoon Robert had with him a woman she had not met before, small, dark-eyed, perhaps 50, with a straight back and an expression of considered reserve. He introduced her as Elena Castillo, the wife of his foreman Miguel Castillo, and explained that she needed a coat for her daughter's wedding in March, and could Clara make one. Clara said she could and began the process of taking measurements, and Robert stood near the door in the comfortable way he had in this shop now, and Mamie went back to the hem she was working on, and Elena Castillo looked between the two of them with eyes that were very alert and very wise, and said to Mamie in accented but precise English, "You are the seamstress who finished the Christmas orders alone." "I am," Mamie said. "Clara speaks very highly of you. Clara is generous." "Clara is not generous with her professional opinions," Elena said, firmly and with complete accuracy. "She is exacting. If she speaks well of your work, it is because your work is excellent." Mamie looked up from her hem. "Thank you. That means a great deal." Elena nodded, satisfied, and then looked at Robert with an expression that contained an entire conversation's worth of opinion compressed into a glance, and Robert looked at the ceiling with the expression of a man who has decided not to acknowledge that glance on the grounds that acknowledging it would be more complicated than ignoring it. Mamie bent back over her hem and was quiet, and in the quiet she was smiling, just slightly, at the fabric. February was when it changed. It changed not in a single moment, but in the accumulation of moments that February brought, the way snowmelt gathers in a low place until there is suddenly a small lake where yesterday there was just a hollow. She had been spending time at the ranch. Not often, and always for a reason. He had asked her opinion on a bookshelf he was building and whether the spacing was right for the books he had, and she had come out to look because she had strong views about bookshelves. He had asked whether she could take a look at the stitching on his work coat because it was coming apart at the shoulder seam, and she had come out to repair it and stayed for coffee. She had found herself on the North Road on a Sunday afternoon with no better plan, and had kept walking until she was on the porch steps, and he was coming out to meet her as if he had been expecting her, even though she had not said she was coming. The porch was becoming familiar. She knew the particular sound of its boards, which one creaked slightly to the left of the steps, which board was warmer in the morning sun because of how the house was angled. She knew that there was almost always a view worth looking at from the porch, because the land opened up in every direction, and the Kansas sky performed its endless theater of weather and light above it. She knew that standing on the porch in the early evening, when the cold was bearable and the stars were just coming in, felt like standing inside a vast and comprehensible silence. On the first Saturday of February, she was standing on that porch while Robert came out of the house with 2 cups of coffee, and the sky was doing something extraordinary, a sunset of such richness and variety that it seemed almost demonstrative, as if the weather were making a point. And she took the coffee from him and looked out at the land and the sky together, and without thinking about it, without choosing it. The word surfaced from wherever she had been keeping it for 3 years and came out of her mouth in a breath so soft she might have thought she had only thought it. "Home," she said. It was barely a whisper. The wind took it almost before it was formed. And Robert Sheridan, who was standing not 2 feet from her, turned slightly away to look at the sky in the other direction, as though he had just noticed something particularly interesting to the east, and said nothing. She stood there. The word hung in the air around her, or seemed to, and she felt it in her chest like the first green thing after a hard winter, tender and startling and real. It frightened her a little. It frightened her a lot. And it was true. After a moment, she said it again. Quietly but more firmly this time, not a breath but a word. Home. He was still looking east. She could see the line of his jaw, the way he was holding very still with the deliberateness of a man making a choice about his stillness. And she understood, with a clarity that moved through her like warmth, what he was doing. He had heard her. He was pretending not to have heard her, giving her the space to say it again without making her feel exposed by having been witnessed the first time. He was letting her have it, the word and the meaning of the word, without the weight of another person's response pressing down on it before she was ready. She breathed. She looked out at the honey-colored grass and the burning sky and the 2 cottonwood trees, and she let the word be true, standing on his porch in the February cold with a cup of coffee warming her hands. When she finally looked at him, he turned back from his contemplation of the eastern sky, and his expression was careful and open, and he said, "It's going to be a clear night. The stars are good on clear nights." "I know," she said. "I've noticed." They went inside when the cold became too much, and he put more wood on the fire, and she sat in the chair by the fireplace that had become, over these months, something like her chair in this house. And he sat across from her, and they talked about the spring cattle plans and whether Frostbite would ever be reliable enough for real ranch work, and Alina Castillo's daughter's wedding coat, and the book he was reading, a heavy volume of history, well worn, and she thought, "I have to tell him. Not tonight. But I have to tell him, because I have been carrying this long enough, and he should know who I am." She told him in March, on a Sunday afternoon when the first tentative warmth of approaching spring had made the porch bearable again, and they were sitting in the plain wooden chairs he kept out there, not looking at each other but at the land. She told him about Thomas, about the night of the fire, about the cellar door and the orange sky, about her son, whose name was William, who had been 4 years old and loved horses and had never seen Kansas. She told him all of it without stopping, in the steady voice she had learned to use for it, the voice that kept the grief contained enough to be spoken rather than just endured. When she stopped talking, There was a silence that was not empty but full. Robert did not say that he was sorry, though he was. She could see it in every line of his face. He did not say it was God's will or that time would heal it, which were the things people said when they did not know what else to say. He said after a moment, "William loved horses." Her throat tightened unexpectedly. He would stand at any fence and watch them for as long as you let him. He called Frostbite. She stopped, startled. "He never met Frostbite," Robert said gently. "But if he had, I expect he would have called her something better than I did." She laughed. It came out of nowhere, out of the tightness in her throat, came out as a genuine laugh, surprised and helpless and real. And she pressed her hand over her mouth, and then took it away because laughing felt right. Laughing felt like exactly what William would have wanted. William, who had laughed at everything with the wholehearted delight of a 4-year-old who had not yet learned that some things were not for laughing. Robert watched her with the expression of someone who is witnessing something precious and fragile and knows enough not to breathe too hard near it. "I have not told anyone the full of it," she said, when she had composed herself. "Not all at once like that." "You didn't have to tell me." "I wanted to," she said. And then, because it was true and she was done pretending it was not, "I trust you. I don't know quite when that happened, but there it is." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Mamie." Just her name, her first name, the first time he had used it, and the way he said it, low and careful and with a kind of reverence in it, did something to her that she was not going to be able to explain even to herself. "Robert," she said in the same tone. He looked at her steadily with those gray November eyes. "I don't want you to feel pressed," he said. "I'm aware of where you've been and what you've carried. I'm aware that I'm probably not what you planned for yourself out here." "You're not," she agreed. "But then, I stopped planning things the night I found out that plans could burn." He flinched slightly at that, not with discomfort for himself but for her. And then she reached across the space between the two chairs and put her hand over his where it lay on the armrest. And he turned his hand over and closed his fingers around hers. And they sat that way for a long time in the early March light, while the land opened up in front of them and Frostbite moved in the far pasture, and the first red-winged blackbirds of spring called from the creek below the rise. He said, "I have not been," he paused, trying to be accurate, "since Daniel. It's been a long time since I let myself want something that could be taken away." "I know," she said. "I recognize it." "I suppose you do." He looked down at their joined hands. "But I find I want to try again, if you're willing." She thought of the word she had said on his porch in February, the word she had not said since the fire, the word that had come out of her like something long stopped beginning to flow again. "I'm willing," she said. Spring came in earnest after that. The Kansas spring that arrived like a declaration, warm days and late frost, and the grass turning green overnight in the way that always seemed impossible until it happened. Mamie was courted by Robert Sheridan with a seriousness and a tenderness that she had not expected, and that undid her in pieces, in small and large ways throughout the season. He brought her books from his shelf and asked what she thought. He invited her to walk his land with him on Sunday mornings, and explained what he was doing with each piece of it, the practical plans and the longer visions. And he asked her opinion on things in a way that made clear he was asking because he valued her view, not because he felt obligated to. He asked her once whether she liked the sound of cattle at dusk, the distant lowing of them across the grass, and she said she had not thought about it particularly, but now that she did, yes. She found it reassuring somehow, and he looked satisfied, as though she had passed a test he had been nervous about. She brought him the same attention. She learned what he read and started reading it too, so they could talk about it. She learned the names and temperaments of his 3 ranch hands, Marcus, young Pete, and the quiet, dignified Miguel Castillo, who treated her from the first with the grave courtesy of a man who has decided to think well of someone. She learned which problems on the ranch were structural and which were cyclical, and she offered thoughts on both, because she had run a household and understood the logic of a working operation. She found to her own surprise that she had opinions about cattle timing and grazing rotation, and that Robert took those opinions seriously, and that this was one of the most satisfying parts of the whole arrangement. Clara observed all of this with enormous satisfaction and very little comment, which was, from Clara, the highest form of approval. Elena Castillo, whose daughter's coat Mamie had finished in perfect time for the March wedding, was more vocal. "I told Miguel in December," she said, on an afternoon when she had come to the shop for a fitting. "I told him, that man needs that woman and that woman needs that man, and the only question is whether they will see it before one of them does something foolish." "Neither of us was in danger of doing something foolish," Mamie said, carefully pinning the waist of Elena's new skirt. "All people in love are in some danger of something foolish," Elena said serenely. "That is the whole point." Mamie pressed her lips together to keep from smiling into the fabric. April was warm and blustery and full of possibility. On the third Sunday of April, Robert asked Mamie to marry him. He did it on the porch, his porch, which by now she thought of as at least half hers, a thought that no longer frightened her with the same straightforward seriousness he brought to everything. He did not go down on one knee, though he started to and then stopped as if reconsidering. He stood with his hat in his hands and said, "I would very much like to spend the rest of my life with you, Mamie Rourke. I know that's a serious thing to ask. I'm a serious person and I mean it seriously. Will you marry me?" She stood on the porch boards that she knew now the way she knew her own hands, in the April light that came warm from the south and smelled of thawed earth and new grass, and she said, "Robert Sheridan, I will marry you. Yes." He put on his hat so he could take it off again, which was the most endearingly flustered she had ever seen him, and then he put his hands on her face and kissed her, and the porch held them both, and the land spread out in every direction in the green and gold of its late spring best, and she thought, "I am here. I am really here." The wedding was in June, at the church with the crooked weather vane, on a morning of such perfect blue sky clarity that it seemed almost contrived, as if the weather had been consulted. Clara made the dress herself, insisted on it, refused all help from Mamie on the grounds that a woman could not sew her own wedding dress in good conscience. And it was the finest thing Clara had ever made, a simple ivory wool with a fitted bodice and a column of pearl buttons down the back. And Mamie stood in front of Clara's dressing mirror and looked at herself and thought, for the first time in a long time, that she looked like a woman who had a future. Half the town came. The other half sent their regards and then showed up anyway. Ida Mercer cried openly and made no apology for it. Deputy Tomas Vega tipped his hat so many times during the ceremony that his hat eventually fell off entirely, which caused a small disruption and a large amount of suppressed laughter. Elena Castillo sat in the front row with Miguel and looked as pleased as if she had arranged the whole thing herself, which was not entirely inaccurate. Robert said his vows in a voice that was steady and quiet and direct, looking at her face the whole time as if he was reading something written there that he needed to memorize. She said hers in the voice she had practiced in her room the night before, not the contained voice she used for grief, but her own voice, her real voice, which she had been getting reacquainted with over the past months. When the preacher said they were married, Robert put his hands on her waist and kissed her and then said, close to her ear, "Come on, Mrs. Sheridan, let's go home." And she said it too, without fear, clear and sure. "Yes, let's go home." Home was the ranch on the North Road, and she moved into it with the full weight of her intention. She brought her carpet bag, and Thomas's pocket watch, and her sewing kit, and the knowledge she had accumulated of who she was and what she had survived and what she wanted. She moved into the rooms of Robert's house and made them theirs, not by displacing his things but by adding herself to them, the way you add something to a recipe that is good on its own and makes it better. She put her books beside his on the shelves. She rearranged the kitchen with his permission and his assistance, and made it more efficient, and discovered that two people who both knew how to cook could produce considerably better meals than either of them alone. She found the leaky window latch in the upstairs bedroom and fixed it herself before he knew it needed fixing, and when he noticed, he stood in the doorway and looked at the latch, and then at her with an expression she chose not to analyze too carefully, because it would have made her cry. Summer unrolled itself across the ranch. Mamie learned the rhythms of a cattle operation the way she learned everything, by paying close attention and asking questions without embarrassment. Robert taught her to ride properly, which required a significant renegotiation with Frostbite, who had views about carrying anyone but Robert but eventually, grudgingly, conceded. The ranch hands Marcus, young Pete, and Miguel absorbed her presence into the daily life of the place with the practical good humor of men who appreciated competent and reasonable company, which she provided. She kept her work with Clara, going into town 3 days a week. She and Robert had discussed this before the wedding and agreed on it easily, because he understood that her work was part of who she was and not a thing he had the right to ask her to put away, and she had been grateful for his understanding without being surprised by it, because she knew him well enough by then to have expected it. She discovered that she loved the evenings on the ranch in a way she had not loved any particular time of day for years. The way the light changed across the land, the way the horses moved in the pasture in the low gold of late afternoon, the way the silence had depth to it, not the silence of emptiness, but the silence of a full place settling into rest. She and Robert had a habit of sitting on the porch after supper, sometimes talking, sometimes reading, sometimes just sitting, and this habit was one of the central pleasures of her new life in a way that she could not have explained but did not need to. Thomas's pocket watch she moved to the windowsill of the bedroom, face up now. She had not put it face up in 3 years. She did it one September morning, the 7th of September, which would have been Thomas's birthday had he lived, and she stood looking at it for a long time while the morning light came through the window and lay across the floor in long bright stripes. Robert came up behind her and put his hand on her shoulder, and she leaned back against him, and he did not say anything, and they stood that way for a while, honoring what was honoring. "He would have liked it here," she said. "William, he would have spent every day in that barn." "I know," Robert said, though he had never met her son because she had told him enough that he knew, and that was enough. "I'm glad we're here," she said. "I'm glad I'm here." "So am I," he said. "Every day. So am I." She turned and pressed her face into the side of his neck for a moment, not crying. She was not crying, just being still against him, being held, which was something she had forgotten and remembered. October arrived, the first anniversary of her arrival in Harlan's Creek. She thought about this on the morning of the 14th, standing in the kitchen of the ranch house making coffee, watching the steam curl from the pot and the early light come through the east-facing window, and she felt the particular texture of a year, the weight and shape of it, what had been in it, how different this standing was from the last time she had stood on this date, uncertain and alone and carrying everything. Robert came down from upstairs and she handed him his coffee and said, "It's been a year." "A year since you stepped off the stage," he said. "A year since I walked into Pete Ambrose's store and a man told me that his horse was listening and just not agreeing yet." He smiled into his coffee. "A year since a woman told me there was a difference between listening and agreeing, and she was right." She raised her cup. He raised his. They did not make a toast because they were both the kind of people who found verbal toasts slightly self-conscious, but the raising of the cups was its own ceremony, its own acknowledgement of what the year had been. A week after the anniversary, she told him she was expecting a child. She told him on the porch in the October evening, because the porch was where the most important things happened between them, and that was right and she knew it. She told him and then watched his face do everything: surprise, joy, a complex rush of emotion that passed through him visibly like weather passing over land. He put down his coffee cup very carefully on the porch railing and looked at her for a long moment and said, "Mamie." "Robert," she said. He said, "Are you?" and could not finish. "I'm glad," she said. "I'm frightened and I'm glad, both things." He reached out and took her hand and she felt the steadiness of his grip, the sureness of it. "Both things are allowed," he said. "Both things are right." "Yes," she said, "I think so too." The winter of 1883 was long, and she was sick early on. sick in the mornings in the forthright way that the body sometimes asserted its new preoccupations. And Robert managed the early mornings with a practical tenderness that she found both touching and slightly hilarious, given that he was a man who had never particularly imagined himself navigating this particular territory. "You don't have to hover," she told him one morning in December when he appeared in the bedroom doorway with a cup of weak tea and an expression of focused concern. "I'm not hovering," he said. "I'm offering tea. That's assistance, not hovering." "The distinction is subtle," she said, but she took the tea. Alina Castillo came in December to sit with her and share things that Alina knew from her own experience. The practical knowledge of a woman who had brought children into the world and raised them competently, and had views on what helped and what did not. Mamie received this knowledge gratefully, because she was not going to pretend to expertise she did not have, and because Alina's manner of imparting it, matter of fact and warm in equal parts, was exactly what she needed. Clara made her a nursing robe in January. Clara made it beautiful, which was unnecessary and therefore exactly right. Spring came again, and with it the slower, heavier days of the final months of the pregnancy, and Mamie moved through the ranch and the town and her work with the careful attentiveness of a woman who has already learned what can be lost and intends to do everything within her power to bring this new life safely into the world. On the 2nd of May, 1884, she gave birth to a son. The labor was long and hard, and she did not complain about it, which was not quite accurate. She said several things in its course that she would not have said in company, and Robert, who held her hand throughout, absorbed them without flinching, which was one more thing she would love him for. The doctor was there, reliable Emmett Price from Virginia who had never been warm since, and Alina Castillo, and by the time the morning was over, Mamie Sheridan was holding a son. He was red-faced and assertively vocal, and had already a suggestion of his father's gray eyes and his mother's stubborn chin. Robert stood beside the bed and looked at this new person with an expression so unguarded that Mamie felt she was seeing something private, something she would store away carefully and keep. "What do we call him?" Robert said. They had discussed names. They had a list, a reasonable list of several names, but she had kept one back, held it to herself to see how it felt when the time came. "William Robert Sheridan," she said. He looked at her. She watched him understand, watched him take the measure of the name and what it held, the honoring of the son she had lost, carried forward into this son who was beginning, and his jaw worked slightly, and he said nothing for a moment. Then he said, "William Robert Sheridan," as if confirming it, as if making it true with his voice. "If you're willing," she said. "I am," he said. "I am very willing." He leaned down and kissed her forehead, and then very gently, with the careful hands of a man who works with large animals and understands the weight of delicate things, he took his son in his arms. The summer that William Robert Sheridan was born was one of the good ones. Rain enough to keep the grass green, heat enough to warm the bones without breaking the spirit, a long stretch of golden September that seemed to insist on being enjoyed. Mamie recovered her strength with the same determined practicality she brought to everything, helped by Robert's insistence on sharing every possible task, and Miguel Castillo's quiet increase of efficiency in the ranch operations to ease the burden, and Alina's Tuesday and Thursday visits with food and practical help, and the easy conversation of women who have become real friends. William, the new William, her living William, was a sturdy, curious infant who regarded the world with an attention that Mamie recognized. He was interested in everything: the light on the floor, the sound of the horses, the patterns on the patchwork quilt she made for his cradle, which she sewed in the evenings on the porch through August, with Robert beside her reading and the land spread out quiet and green in the dusk. The cradle Robert built himself. He built it over the course of 2 weeks in the barn, working in the evenings, and when he carried it into the bedroom she ran her hands over the wood and found it smooth and solid, and she looked at the man who had made it and felt the full weight of her love for him as a physical thing. "You made this," she said. "It's not complicated," he said, but he was pleased. "You made this for him," she said. You made him something to sleep in that will last." She looked up. "Thank you." He came and put his arms around her, and she leaned against him, and they stood there in the bedroom with the cradle between them and the evening coming in through the window, and she thought of how very far she had come from the woman who had stepped off a stage in October of 1882 with a carpet bag and a grief she thought she would carry forever. She was still carrying some of it. You did not put down the dead. You only learned to hold them differently. But the grief was no longer the primary thing. The primary thing now was this man and this child and this land and this porch and this life that she had not planned and could not have imagined and had been given, by some strange and ungovernable mercy, the chance to build. She was in the shop with Clara on a Tuesday in October, the 2nd October, 2 years now from her arrival, when a new woman came to the door. She was young, perhaps 20, with a baby on her hip and a look of determined composure that Mamie recognized from the inside. Her name was Annie Holt, and she had come from Illinois with her husband 6 months ago, and her husband had taken sick in August and died of the fever in September, and she was alone now with a 4-month-old and no family within 1,000 miles and very little money. She needed work. She said so plainly, without apology or excess of grief, in the manner of a woman who had already finished the part where she fell apart and was now in the part where she carried on. Clara and Mamie looked at each other. Clara said, "Can you sew?" Passably, Annie said. "Not like you, but I can learn." "Then we'll teach you," Clara said. Mamie said, "There's a room at Ida Mercer's boarding house that has good light and a decent stove. I'll take you to her this afternoon if you like." Annie Holt looked at her with the expression of someone receiving help who has been afraid to hope for it and said, "I would like that very much. Thank you." She had a daughter, Mamie noted, a girl who looked at the world with the same interested severity as William. She thought of her own first weeks in this town, of Clara's brisk kindness, of the coffee that Robert had brought on a December afternoon, of the ways people had made room for her. She was making room now. That was how it worked. That was how it was supposed to work. She walked Annie Holt to Ida Mercer's boarding house in the October afternoon, William bundled against her hip in the carrying cloth she had learned to use from Alina, and she told Annie a little of her own story because she thought it might help to know that the shape of it alone, new, uncertain, was not a permanent shape. "Does it get better?" Annie said, not in a desperate way, in the way of someone asking for practical information. "Yes," Mamie said. "It gets different first. And then, if you let it, it gets better." She went back to the ranch that evening with the particular lightness of someone who has done something small and right, and Robert was on the porch in the late afternoon sun with William on his knee, the baby reaching for his father's beard with small, determined fists, and Robert was talking to him in the patient, reasonable tone he had once used on Frostbite, which worked considerably better on William. She came up the porch steps and leaned against the railing and looked at them, and Robert looked up and said, "Good day." "Good day," she said. He shifted William to his other knee and made room, and she sat beside him in the other chair and leaned over and kissed him, and he kissed her back with the warmth of a man who was exactly where he had chosen to be, and William made a sound of tremendous indignation at being momentarily ignored and reached for both of them with both hands, which was only fair. 3 years passed in the way that good years do, quickly and fully, each season bringing its own distinct character and concerns and pleasures. The ranch expanded modestly, from 140 cattle to 180, which Robert managed with careful deliberateness. Marcus moved on to a ranch farther west, and they hired 2 new hands, a young man named John Cooper, who turned out to be one of the best natural horsemen Robert had ever seen, and an older man, Gray Webb, who had been cowboying since the days before the war and knew more about cattle than most veterinarians. The ranch settled into a working life that was full and demanding and good. Mamie's work at Clara's shop continued to give her satisfaction and independence, and Clara had by this time begun to talk about eventually handing the shop over to Mamie, a conversation that Mamie redirected each time it arose because Clara was not yet ready to stop working and they both knew it. but the conversation's existence was meaningful in itself, a kind of inheritance being offered by a woman with no daughters and received by a woman who had found in this work a professional life she was proud of. Young Annie Holt learned to sew well beyond passably. She learned with the focused determination of someone for whom competence was not optional but necessary, and within a year she was contributing real skill to the shop. She had, in the second year, met and carefully and sensibly married Deputy Tomas Vega, who had by this time grown somewhat less overwhelmingly earnest and into a genuinely good man, and who loved Annie's daughter Lily with the wholehearted certainty of a father by intention, which was exactly the same as any other kind. The wedding was at the church with the crooked weather vane, and Mamie made Annie's dress, and Clara made it clear that this was a professional rivalry she intended to continue by making Annie's winter coat in response, and everyone in Harlan's Creek appreciated the ongoing excellence this competition produced. William Robert Sheridan grew into a boy who was, as Mamie had predicted, horse-mad from the moment he could walk to the fence and look over it. He and Frostbite arrived at a mutual understanding in William's third year that had eluded most other humans, and Robert watched this alliance develop with a combination of pride and slight suspicion, convinced that the horse was playing a long game of some kind. "She likes him better than she likes you," Mamie said, on a morning in late summer when William was 3 years old, standing at the pasture fence while Frostbite walked over and put her head down to be patted. "She does," Robert agreed without apparent offense. "I built this ranch from nothing, and that horse saves her best behavior for a 3-year-old. He has better treats," Mamie said. "He has my sugar cubes," Robert said with resignation. She laughed and he looked at her, and the look between them was the easy, layered look of people who know each other through all their seasons and love what they know. In the autumn of 1886, 4 years after Mamie's arrival in Harlan's Creek, she discovered she was expecting again. She told Robert on the porch in October because of course she did, and he received the news with the same moved seriousness as the first time and held her hand and said, "Both things aloud." "Both things," she agreed, glad and a little frightened. "That seems right," he said. This time she was less sick, and the winter was milder, and the pregnancy was, as Emmett Price said in his dry Virginia way textbook. On the 3rd of April, 1887, Mamie Sheridan gave birth to a daughter. The daughter was also loud and also red-faced, but her eyes were brown from the first, her mother's eyes, and she had a full head of dark hair that astonished everyone and delighted William, who was 3 years old and had been told he was going to have a sibling and had taken this news with a seriousness that suggested he understood its implications even if he couldn't have articulated what those were. "Her name," Robert said. Mamie had thought about this. She said, "Clara Ann. For Clara, because she took me in when I needed it, and because she will not admit she cares about this baby as much as she does." She looked at him. "If that suits you." "Clara Ann Sheridan," Robert said. "It suits me perfectly." Clara Hodge, when she was told, removed her wire-rimmed spectacles and cleaned them with the particular thoroughness that she employed when she did not want anyone to see her face for a moment. And then she put them back on and said that it was a very sensible name, and that she approved of it entirely, and that she expected the girl to have good taste in fabrics. William was introduced to his sister with great ceremony, and he looked at her with the focused attention he brought to everything that interested him, which was considerable, at 3 years old, and then looked up and said, "She is very small." "She will get bigger," Robert said. "Frostbite doesn't like small things," William said with concern. "Frostbite will manage," his father assured him. She did in fact manage. Clara Ann Sheridan grew at the rate that healthy children grew, and William grew alongside her, and the ranch house that had been built for one and expanded to hold 2 expanded again, without structural alteration, to hold 4, because that was what houses did when they were properly homes. On the morning of the 4th of November, 1887, 5 years to the month from Mamie's arrival in Harlan's Creek, she was on the porch in the early morning, which was still and cold and bright, with a cup of coffee, while inside she could hear the sounds of the house waking up. Robert's voice, low and reassuring, answering some question from William. The beginnings of Clara Ann's morning commentary, which was already at 7 months quite pointed. The land in front of her was covered in a thin early frost that caught the light and held it, 1,000 small points of brightness across the grass. She stood there for a long time. She thought about the woman who had arrived here 5 years ago, thin-coated and hollow-eyed, carrying a grief so calcified she had started to mistake it for character. She thought about the root cellar door and the orange sky, and all the years of careful survival that had followed. She thought about a stagecoach and a mercantile and a gray horse with opinions, and a man who told her there was a difference between listening and agreeing. She thought about a cup of coffee and a kitchen with bookshelves, and a porch in February, and a word that she had said like something returning to life. She thought about all the things she had not known she was walking toward. The door opened behind her and Robert came out, 2 coffee cups, his hair still sleep-disordered, and he handed her the cup and stood beside her and looked out at the frosty land. "William wants to know if we can go to see the Castillos today," he said. "Miguel told him the new foal might be ready to see." "He's been talking about that foal for 3 weeks," Mamie said. "He has views about horses that have been clearly inherited." She smiled. "From which parent do you think?" Robert looked at the sky with exaggerated innocence, undetermined. She leaned against him, and he put his arm around her shoulders, and they stood together on the porch and looked at the January-coming land and the enormous Kansas sky above it, which was performing its usual unembarrassed theater of cloud and light. "Robert," she said. "Mamie," he said. "I'm glad I walked up that north road," she said. He pressed his lips to the side of her head. "I'm glad you kept going past the fork," he said. "I used to watch that road from the pasture, hoping someone interesting would come up it." She tilted her head to look at him. "Did you watch for me specifically?" "I didn't know it was you I was waiting for," he said. "But yes." She settled back against him. "Home," she said, to the porch and the land and the man beside her and the children inside and the whole wide fact of her life. He said into her hair, "Home." They stood there while the frost burned off the grass in the morning sun, and the land came back to its full color, and the sounds from inside grew louder and more insistent, and somewhere in the far pasture Frostbite tossed her head at the cold and began her morning circuit of the fence line, and Clara Ann's morning commentary achieved a new intensity, and William's voice appeared at the door saying, "Mama, Papa, can we go today?" And Robert called back, "Give us 5 minutes, Will," and William said very audibly, "That is what you always say," and Robert said, "Because it is always what I mean," and Mamie laughed, and the laugh went out into the open air and the open land and was entirely at home there. Later that morning, when William was dressed and fed and conducting a one-sided negotiation with his coat buttons, and Clara Ann was wide-eyed and babbling in Mamie's arms, and Robert was hitching the wagon for the drive to the Castillo Ranch, Mamie looked around the kitchen, the scarred table, the shelves with their doubled row of books, the window with its view of the north sky, the pocket watch on the sill in the morning light, face up, running, and felt the full weight and substance of what she had been given. She had not replaced what she had lost. She had never believed that was possible, and she had been right. William was still William, a 4-year-old boy who had loved horses and had a father who died and a mother who survived, and that was all still true and would always be true, and she carried it with her everywhere she went, and she had made peace with that carrying. But peace was not the same as forgetting, and it was not the same as stopping, and she had not stopped. She had said home again, and meant it completely and truly and without reservation. And the man who had given her the grace of hearing it twice, once for herself and once to be sure, was standing in the yard now with a wagon and a waiting horse, and their son was finally winning against the coat buttons, and their daughter was reaching for the sunlight on the kitchen floor, and the door was open, and the day was good. She walked outside. The years that followed were the years of a life fully inhabited. She and Robert were not a perfect couple in the way of stories. They disagreed sometimes, firmly and fairly, about ranch decisions and child rearing and the proper management of a flu in cold weather, and occasionally with some heat about larger things, but they had both lived long enough in the company of their own character to fight well, which meant honestly, and to repair well, which meant completely. They never let a quarrel stand unaddressed for more than a day, because they were both old enough to know that time was not unlimited, and quarrels were not worth the time they consumed. Clara Ann Sheridan was a girl of fierce and lively personality, who seemed to have inherited the best organizational qualities of both her parents and the stubbornness of all four of her grandparents. By the time she was 2, she was firmly in charge of a considerable portion of the household, an authority she exercised with great confidence and excellent taste. Robert observed this development with the admiration of a man watching someone run a cattle operation with impressive efficiency. Mamie observed it with a recognition that was both proud and slightly wary. William was, at 5 and 6 and 7, exactly the boy she had expected him to be, serious and interested and gentle with animals, and very good at the kind of slow, patient attention that made horses trust you. Robert began teaching him to ride on a reliable old mare named Bessie, who had none of Frostbite's artistic temperament, and William absorbed the instruction with the same serious focus he brought to everything. And by his 6th birthday, he could be trusted to take Bessie around the near pasture unaccompanied. And the pride on Robert's face when he watched was something Mamie kept in her memory like a folded cloth in a drawer, to take out and look at when she needed to remember the best things. In the spring of 1889, Kansas achieved statehood. It had been a state since 1861, of course, but the Western territories were organizing themselves with new energy, and the conversations in Harlan's Creek about the changing frontier carried their own particular weight. The open range era was coming to an end, the big ranchers feeling the pressure of smaller homesteaders, the railroads changing everything they touched, the world that had existed in the wild and unstructured form of the early cattle days giving way to something more organized, more settled, not without loss but not without gain either. Robert adjusted. He was a practical man, and he had always seen the ranch as a working thing rather than a romantic idea, and so he adapted his operation to the changing landscape, fencing his land properly and making agreements with his neighbors that were clear and documented, and moving his cattle operation toward quality over quantity, which he had been building toward for years anyway. Mamie, at the shop, watched the town change around her and felt it as something primarily positive: more women coming into Harlan's Creek with families, the school expanding, the church getting a new weather vane that was at least slightly less crooked than the first one, the community growing its own deeper roots. Annie Holt Vega was by now an accomplished seamstress in her own right, and the 3 women, Clara, Mamie, and Annie, ran the shop between them with a collective competence that was the envy of shops in larger towns. On an evening in October of 1889, Mamie was on the porch alone. Robert was inside putting the children to bed, Clara Ann requiring a substantial negotiation about the exact number of stories she was entitled to, William requiring no negotiation but considerable earnest conversation about horses and the behavior of horses, and whether Frostbite's personality was inherited or learned. She could hear his voice through the open window, the patient, reasonable tone he used with horses and children with equal success. She had a cup of tea, and the October stars were coming in above the dark horizon, sharp and cold and infinite, and she thought about 7 years. 7 years since October of 1882. She had been in Harlan's Creek for 7 years, and she had been on this porch for 6 of them, and she had said the word home for 6 years now, easily and without fear, and the word had expanded to hold everything she had put into it. She heard the front door and then Robert's boot steps on the porch boards, and then he was beside her with his own cup of tea, because he had switched to tea in the evenings at her suggestion a year ago and had never complained about the change, which was the kind of small accommodation that told you everything you needed to know about a marriage. He sat down. She looked at him. He looked at the stars. They were quiet together in the particular way of people who have been quiet together many times and found it good. 7 years, she said. 7 years, he agreed. Are you glad? He turned and looked at her with the full attention of a man who does not answer important questions carelessly. Mamie, he said, I am more than glad. I don't have a word for it that is big enough. I'm everything good that I know how to be because of you, because you came up that north road and didn't stop at the fork. She reached across and took his hand. He turned his palm over and closed his fingers the same as he always did. Me too, she said. All of that, me too. Inside, Clara Ann had apparently won the story negotiation, because there was a triumphant sound and then Robert's voice through the window. But wait, it was Robert Sheridan's recorded voice. An old recording. No, it was William's voice, reading aloud because William could read now, read with the focused pleasure of a boy who had discovered that books were another form of attention, another way to pay careful watch to the world. She listened to her son's voice reading in the lamplight, and she held her husband's hand on the porch of their home, and the stars multiplied above the open Kansas land, and the frost would come in the morning and the horses would move in the cold, and the children would wake demanding breakfast and Clara Ann would have opinions about it. And Mamie Sheridan, who had once been Mamie Rourke, who had once stood in front of an orange sky with nothing left and told herself she would survive, who had survived and then found, astonishingly, that survival was only the beginning, looked out at her life and found it good, found it full, found it, in every sense of the word that mattered, home. The pocket watch on the bedroom windowsill kept its patient time. The cottonwood trees turned gold every autumn and bare every winter and green every spring. The porch held them, season after season, for all the years that came after, which were many and which were, on balance, good.